He watched his sister steal his research and no one believed him. Not his parents, not the university. But what if I told you that betrayal was only the beginning, and that the boy they ignored would one day light up the world? This is a story about being invisible and choosing to be seen. Ethan Carter had always known how to disappear. Not in the literal sense, but in the kind of silence a child grows into when the walls around him speak louder than his own voice ever could. At 32, Ethan was a respected biochemical researcher working in a modest but well-equipped lab in Columbus, Ohio. His colleagues admired his discipline, his quiet intensity, his ability to spend hours focused on microscopic data. Few, if any, knew about the hollow that sat beneath that composure, one carved not by trauma but by absence. He was to the world a man of order, but inside him the echoes of an invisible boy still wandered the silent rooms of his past. His childhood home stood on a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Dayton, Ohio, nestled between identical lawns and white picket fences. The Carter household was unremarkably average, a family unit built on politeness and practicality. Richard Carter, the father, was a stoic hardware store manager with a fondness for tools and talk radio. Elaine, his mother, taught piano out of their living room and organized school bake sales with unwavering cheer. Ethan, their firstborn, was a quiet, cerebral boy who loved books, puzzles, and the stars. Then came Madison, 4 years younger, all laughter and drama ribbons and applause. From the moment she could walk, Madison drew attention like a magnet. She twirled through family gatherings, told jokes at dinner, sang off-key but confidently. Where Ethan was deliberate and inward, Madison was light and spectacle. It wasn't that she tried to overshadow him. She simply had a way of taking up space without realizing how much was left for anyone else. Ethan's earliest memories were colored by the contrast. His 5th-grade science project, a meticulously constructed model of the solar system, earned him first prize at the regional fair. He brought the medal home, beaming. That same day, Madison had won a classroom coloring contest. Her drawing, a messy, rainbow-hued pony, was taped to the fridge before Ethan had even taken his shoes off. "It's so bright," his mom exclaimed. Ethan's medal stayed in his backpack for a week. By the time he entered high school, the pattern had hardened into something permanent. Madison was in cheerleading, student council, drama club. Ethan was in advanced placement classes, science club, and the library. Madison had stories to share at dinner. Ethan had test scores. His parents praised him, yes, but softly, distractedly, as if checking a box. There were no celebratory dinners when he got a perfect score on his SATs. No gasps of pride when his chemistry teacher nominated him for a national competition. Meanwhile, Madison's every triumph, no matter how trivial, was greeted with celebration. Her volleyball team made semifinals, pizza night. She got asked to prom, new dress. Ethan learned to expect nothing. One evening near the end of senior year, Ethan came home with life-changing news. He'd been selected as a finalist for the National Chemistry Olympiad. Only 20 students in the country had been chosen. He stood in the doorway, holding the letter in both hands. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," his mother said, glancing up from folding laundry. "Could you set the table? Your sister's having a few friends over." 2 days later, Madison was voted most likely to marry a celebrity. The family threw her a party. He didn't hold it against Madison. She was a product of the pedestal she'd been placed on. Ethan never felt hatred toward her, only an ache, a dull confusion that settled deeper each year. At Thanksgiving, he sat at the far end of the table while relatives gushed over Madison's new hairstyle. When he moved into his college dorm, his father dropped him off, handed him a box, and said, "Don't forget to call your mother." It wasn't neglect exactly, it was invisibility. Ethan was the wallpaper of the family, present, reliable, unremarkable. And the thing about silence is that it accumulates. Layer by layer, year by year, it becomes its own kind of noise, one you learn to carry. Now looking back from his quiet apartment in Columbus surrounded by beakers and data charts, Ethan often wondered who he might have become if only someone had looked at him and truly seen, but that story was just beginning. Ethan's fascination with science didn't begin in a lab. It began in the backyard. At age 8, he spent hours examining soil, mixing rainwater with flower petals, pretending he was inventing medicine for imaginary diseases. Where most kids saw mud, Ethan saw potential. The world to him was an unsolved equation, but it wasn't until the 5th grade that someone finally noticed. Ms. Rachel Donovan was his homeroom teacher that year, young, perceptive, and unlike any adult Ethan had encountered. She saw through his quiet demeanor, past the lowered eyes and polite silences, and discovered a restless mind humming beneath. One afternoon after class, she crouched beside his desk and held up his science journal. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Ethan shrugged, unsure whether she was about to scold or praise. "This is the start of a future scientist." "You have a gift, Ethan. Don't let anyone make you feel small for it." That sentence would echo in his memory for years. In a world where he felt unseen, those words were a rare form of oxygen. Ms. Donovan encouraged Ethan to enter the district science fair. He proposed a project on photosynthesis under varied artificial lights. She lent him books, stayed after school to help him build models, and taught him how to write an abstract. Ethan won 2nd place, losing only to a high schooler competing down a grade. Ms. Donovan clapped louder than anyone. Back at home, the reception was lukewarm. His mother had nodded, barely looking up from her music sheets. "That's nice, dear. Can you keep it off the kitchen table? Madison's friends are coming over." Over time, Ethan stopped trying to share his successes. He built small experiments in his room, creating homemade pH indicators, testing plant growth under different conditions, assembling a rudimentary telescope from a kit he bought with allowance money. He wanted to attend a summer science camp that cost $300. When he asked, his father frowned and said, "That's a lot of money for microscopes and junk. Don't you want to go to the lake with your cousins instead?" Madison, by contrast, was sent to a performing arts retreat that cost triple that amount. In high school, Ethan joined the science club, often staying late to use the lab. He saved lunch money to buy second-hand chemistry sets from eBay. Once he built a working model of a wind turbine from spare parts and entered it in the state fair. His parents didn't attend. Madison had a cheer competition the same day. "You understand, don't you?" his mother asked. And of course he did. But every snub became fuel, every absence a silent motivator. Ethan didn't chase praise anymore, he chased excellence. He devoured textbooks, read research papers far beyond his grade level, and spent nights simulating chemical reactions on outdated software. In his junior year, the high school counselor called him in. "You've got potential, Ethan," she said, flipping through his file. "With your GPA and scores, we could look at Ivy Leagues, maybe even scholarships." For the first time, Ethan dared to imagine a future that stretched beyond Dayton, beyond invisibility. But that vision came with its own obstacles. When he brought home brochures from MIT, Caltech, and Stanford, his father scoffed. "Those places are for kids with money or connections." "Let's be realistic, son. Why not the state university close to home, decent programs?" his mother added gently. "We just can't afford anything fancy, not with Madison's dance school fees this year." The words didn't sting, they cut. Ethan folded the brochures and hid them in a drawer. But he didn't stop dreaming. If anything, he pushed harder. Not to spite them, but to prove to himself more than anyone that he was more than background noise. Every late night in the library, every practice test, every scribbled formula in the margins of his notebooks was an act of quiet rebellion. If love couldn't find him at home, maybe greatness could. By senior year, Ethan's determination had solidified into something unshakable. He had finished top of his class, crushed his SATs, and submitted applications to some of the most prestigious universities in the country. As acceptance letters rolled in Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, he kept them stacked in a drawer, unopened at first, like fragile dreams he wasn't sure he was allowed to believe in. The day he showed his parents, he didn't expect a parade, but he hoped deep down for a flicker of pride, for a moment that might tilt the family scales even briefly in his favor. His father read the letters silently, brows furrowed. His mother sat at the kitchen table, thumbing through the Columbia packet. Well, Richard finally said, these places cost a fortune. Ethan had anticipated this. I've been awarded merit scholarships from all of them. Not full rides, but enough to cover a big chunk. I'd still need some support. Maybe a loan, or Elaine interrupted. How much are we talking? About $20,000 per year after scholarships, Ethan said. I can work part-time. Maybe take summer classes to graduate early. Richard leaned back in his chair. Son, we can give you $40,000 total. That's what we can do. 4 years, that's it. Ethan nodded slowly. It wasn't nothing, but it meant that Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia, each offering him a future beyond anything he had known, were now just names on paper. He wanted to ask, what about Madison? Will she get the same offer? But he didn't. Later that week, he overheard them talking in the living room. Madison was a sophomore then and struggling in her classes. We'll need to set aside more for Madison's college, Elaine said. She'll need more help than Ethan. She's not as self-sufficient, Richard agreed. Ethan's the type who can land on his feet. The next day, Ethan sat with the acceptance letters again, laid them out on his bed like open doors, then gently folded them back into their envelopes. He enrolled at the State University, Ohio State, on a full academic scholarship. It wasn't a defeat, he told himself. It was a strategy. He would still rise, still shine. But part of him knew this was a compromise born not of limitation but of hierarchy. The final blow came one evening when he was loading dishes after dinner. His mother stood by the sink, wiping a glass, not quite looking at him. Ethan, she said, you're so capable, you don't really need more Madison. She's more sensitive. She's going to need us a little longer. The words dropped like coins in a jar already full. It wasn't the money. It was the message: your resilience makes you less deserving. Your strength makes you less important. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't ask for more. He simply nodded and finished the dishes. That night he wrote in his journal, sometimes being the strong one means being left behind. He would go on. He would build his future. But something in him had quietly closed. He returned to his room and stared at the sealed envelopes. He traced the embossed university crests with the fingertip symbols of what could have been. They weren't just letters. They were alternate timelines. Lives he would never live. He slipped them into a folder and placed it at the back of his closet, behind old science fair trophies and yellowing certificates. Weeks later, as he toured Ohio State during freshman orientation, he watched parents dote on their children. Some cried, some laughed, some took dozens of photos. His own parents hadn't come. Madison had a dentist appointment that day. You'll be fine, honey, his mother said over the phone. You always are. Ethan smiled politely. He always did. And still the hunger remained, not for vengeance, not for validation, but for a life that felt his own. He walked across the campus, quad backpack slung over one shoulder, the wind carrying whispers of ambition. He didn't know it yet, but something inside him had ignited, not with fanfare, quietly, like a fuse. And someday he would burn bright enough that no one could pretend they hadn't seen. At Ohio State, Ethan's days began before sunrise and ended long after the campus lights flickered to life. He had mapped out every hour, every dollar with surgical precision. 3 jobs: mornings at the library reshelving books, evenings brewing lattes at a local cafe, and weekends serving tables at a noisy downtown diner. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, about refusing to rely on anyone who once told him he needed less. His first semester was a blur of textbooks, shifts, and silent meals in the shared dorm kitchen. While other freshmen joined clubs, went to parties, or found love, Ethan stacked trays and calculated tips. There was no time for distractions, no budget for indulgence. His world was held together with a thread of sheer willpower. At the library, he found temporary solace in the stillness of books. While organizing stacks, he often whispered scientific theories under his breath, preparing for tests, reassuring himself he was still moving forward. The cafe was louder, smellier, full of impatient students and underpaid baristas. But the rhythm of steaming milk, grinding beans, and scribbling names on cups gave him a strange sense of structure. The diner, however, was chaos incarnate. Greasy orders, spilled drinks, children screaming, co-workers smoking on break. It was exhausting, but it paid more in tips than the other 2 combined. He barely slept, ate on the go, and showered in record time. But his grades never slipped. If anything, he studied harder, scored higher, because this painful routine was his proof that he was capable, that he could endure. Then came Madison's call. She was giddy, chatting about her new roommate at Emerson College in Boston, a school Ethan hadn't even dared apply to. "She's from LA and her dad's a producer." Madison laughed. "We're already planning a spring break trip. Mom says she'll cover it if I keep my grades up." Ethan listened, staring at the coffee stains on his textbook. Her words didn't sting because they were malicious, they stung because they were oblivious. "Anyway," she continued, "you always like to study. I guess this kind of stuff isn't your thing." He murmured something polite and hung up. That night, as he burned his fingers on a steam wand, he wondered how different things might have been had he been born second. Still, amidst the monotony, something shifted during his second semester. A new roommate, Lucas Reyes, a transfer student from Chicago majoring in philosophy and anthropology, sharp-witted, thoughtful, and unfazed by silence. Lucas moved in with a crate of books and a record player, and within days the room felt different. "What's your story?" Lucas asked one night, reclining on his bed as Miles Davis played in the background. Ethan hesitated. "Nothing special. I study. I work." "Yeah, but who are you beneath the armor?" No one had ever asked him that before, not like that. Bit by bit, Ethan opened up. About the scholarships, the jobs, the rejection wrapped in love, and then one night about his imaginary friend. "When I was a kid," Ethan said quietly, "I used to talk to someone, a friend. He didn't have a name, just someone who listened." Lucas didn't laugh. He just nodded. "You created a witness, someone to validate your existence." That moment cracked something open. They stayed up talking until sunrise about life, pain, identity. Lucas, who came from a loud, supportive Puerto Rican family, didn't pretend to understand Ethan's silence, but he honored it. Over the next months, Lucas became Ethan's mirror, the first person who saw him whole, not just as a sum of responsibilities. They debated philosophy, made meals together when they could, and studied side by side through sleepless nights. One rainy afternoon, they walked across campus discussing moral philosophy. Ethan admitted he sometimes felt like 2 people, one who performed for survival and another who waited quietly, hoping to be loved for who he truly was. Lucas smiled. "You're not alone. Most people are just louder about hiding." That night, Ethan wrote in his journal, "I'm not invisible. I was just waiting to be known." It didn't erase the weight he carried, but for the first time it felt lighter. Not because the world had changed, but because someone had entered it and stayed. He shared with Lucas his most private memory, the one he had never told anyone. When he was 8, he used to sit behind the house whispering to an invisible figure he called Other Ethan. A boy who looked like him, but wasn't tired, who laughed easily, who told him he was enough. Lucas listened in silence, then said, "He wasn't imaginary. He was a part of you you had to hide to survive. You made a companion out of your pain." And Ethan realized for the first time that his survival had always been rooted in a secret kind of hope. During the start of his second year, Ethan's life took an unexpected turn. His organic chemistry professor, Dr. Harold Kingsley, a renowned researcher known for his no-nonsense style and razor-sharp intellect, approached Ethan after a particularly rigorous exam. "Mr. Carter," Kingsley said, tapping Ethan's blue book with a single finger, "how would you like to work in a real lab instead of just writing about one?" Ethan blinked. "Are you offering me a position?" Kingsley nodded. "I don't usually extend this invitation to undergrads, but your analytical work is exceptional. You think like a researcher." It was the first time someone of authority had acknowledged Ethan's deeper worth, not just his grades, but his mind, and more importantly, his potential. Ethan joined Kingsley's molecular biochemistry research group. At first, he fumbled, intimidated by the graduate students unfamiliar with the cutting-edge equipment. But he learned fast. He stayed after hours, asked questions, read papers late into the night. Kingsley pushed him, challenged him, and gradually trusted him. By the spring of that year, Ethan was co-authoring a study on enzyme mutations related to rare genetic diseases. The paper was accepted for presentation at a major national science conference in Chicago. It was more than a line on a resume. It was a milestone, a marker in the ground that proved Ethan wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The announcement stirred a hope that maybe this time his family would see him. He called home. His mother answered, "That's great, honey. Hang on, your sister's about to go on stage." He waited. Madison took the phone and chatted excitedly about her dance recital and a weekend trip with friends. When they hung up, no one had asked for details about the conference. No one had said, "We're proud of you." Lucas noticed the change in Ethan that night. "You okay?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, I guess I expected more." "Silly of me." Lucas frowned. "It's not silly, but some people can only see what they choose to value." That night, Ethan began journaling, not just notes, but thoughts, reflections, ghosts. He wrote about the summer he taught himself calculus with a borrowed textbook, about the Christmas when his microscope broke and no one replaced it, about every time he clapped for his sister while no one clapped for him. The journal became a confessional and a witness. A space where Ethan could validate his own existence, where he wrote about Lucas and his chosen family, where he wrote about resilience not as a badge of honor but a scar that kept reopening. When he arrived in Chicago, he carried his journal in his bag just behind his research notes. The conference center was buzzing. He wore a borrowed suit, his name on a lanyard hanging heavy on his chest. Kingsley introduced him to colleagues with a rare glint of pride. Ethan's presentation room filled quickly. As he stood at the podium, he scanned the crowd. No family. But he wasn't alone. Lucas had traveled with him, sitting in the front row, camera ready. Ethan took a breath and began. He didn't just present the data, he told a story. He spoke of invisible diseases, misdiagnosed cases of lives overlooked. He wove in empathy with precision, speaking to the human cost behind the science. When it ended, the room was silent for a beat, then erupted in applause. A senior researcher approached. "Your presentation? It had heart. That's rare. Don't lose that." Ethan stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air. He looked at the skyline, the towering symbols of ambition and grit. He closed his eyes and exhaled. No one at home had called to ask how it went. But for the first time, it didn't matter. because he had heard his own voice and it had been enough. That night back in the hotel, he opened his journal and wrote, "Today I did something only I could have done. And that makes it matter." He didn't need permission to be proud anymore. He was building a life that didn't rely on applause, and that perhaps was the truest milestone of all. The tension between Ethan and Madison had always been present, simmering beneath layers of politeness and family duty. But now in their final year of college, it rose to the surface in full force. Both siblings unknowingly applied for the same coveted summer internship at the prestigious Langston Institute, a biomedical research program that accepted only 5 students nationwide each year. When Ethan discovered Madison was also applying, a knot formed in his chest. He'd learned long ago that proximity to her often came at a personal cost. Months earlier, over winter break, Madison had visited their parents' home. While rifling through old boxes in the attic, she asked Ethan if she could borrow some of his early college papers just to see how he formatted things. Ethan, unsuspecting and generous, emailed her a collection of his earlier research. One of those papers had evolved into his later published study on enzymatic disorders, which had garnered praise at a national conference. Ethan thought nothing of it until Lucas, now a senior research assistant, attended a networking mixer and came back with a glossy pamphlet. "Ethan," he said slowly, handing him the brochure, "I think you need to see this." On page 4 was a quote from Madison's application essay, verbatim from Ethan's unpublished work. Identical phrases, identical charts. Even a unique metaphor Ethan had coined, comparing molecular behavior to orchestra synchronization. Shock dissolved into a deep ache. He wanted to believe it was coincidence. He reread the document twice more, but the truth was inescapable. Madison had used his work. For a week, Ethan debated what to do. His moral compass clashed with childhood programming. Protect your sister, don't rock the boat, keep the peace, but this wasn't a family dinner dispute. This was his intellectual property, and more than that, his voice. He brought the evidence to his mentor, Dr. Kingsley, who confirmed the overlap and urged Ethan to notify the internship committee. "It's not about vengeance," Kingsley said. "It's about boundaries, about respect." Ethan submitted the report reluctantly, attaching time-stamped files, his original drafts, and links to his prior presentations. Weeks later, the decision letters arrived. Ethan was accepted, Madison was not. The storm broke quickly. Madison called the next day, her voice icy. "How dare you? You knew I was applying. You deliberately sabotaged me. You used my research," Ethan replied calmly. "I didn't sabotage you. I protected my work. You gave it to me. I gave you an early draft to read, not to submit." The argument spiraled. Madison accused him of jealousy, of trying to steal her moment. Then she filed a formal complaint with the Institute, claiming the ideas were co-created and that Ethan had weaponized their shared childhood. The Langston Institute launched a quiet investigation. They requested testimonies, checked submission dates, interviewed Kingsley. The evidence favored Ethan. They upheld his acceptance and dismissed Madison's complaint. But back at home, the verdict was far less kind. Their mother, Elaine, called in fury. "You always compete with her, Ethan. She's been fragile since she was little. You know that I didn't compete. I defended myself. She just needed a little help." She crossed a line. Click. Ethan sat alone in his apartment afterwards, staring at his phone. Not because he was shocked, but because it confirmed what he'd always known: their family's balance was built on his insolence. Madison, meanwhile, began to crumble. The internship rejection hit her hard. Her grades slipped. She pulled away from campus life. Rumors began to circulate about academic dishonesty, about the favoritism she once wore like armor. Professors noticed. Peers gossiped. The sheen of perfection cracked. For the first time in her life, Madison faced consequences. Lucas found Ethan staring out the dorm window one evening. "You okay?" "I thought it would feel like justice," Ethan said. "But it doesn't." Lucas nodded. "Because justice isn't revenge. It's release." Later that night, Ethan wrote in his journal, "I'm not angry anymore, just tired and free." He knew he couldn't save Madison from the storm she created, and for once he chose not to walk into the fire. The auditorium shimmered with soft lighting and quiet anticipation. Students in polished shoes and pressed gowns took their seats among professors, donors, and family members. It was the annual university awards ceremony, the closing celebration before graduation. But this year, a singular spotlight belonged to Ethan Carter. He was the recipient of the Whitaker Medal, the university's highest academic honor. It wasn't just a recognition of grades or attendance. It symbolized brilliance, resilience, and extraordinary contribution to both science and the campus community. When Ethan received the email weeks earlier, he had stared at it in silence. Lucas, who had been in the room, had practically shouted with joy. Ethan, however, didn't smile right away. He had one thought: would his parents come? He hadn't told them. Not yet. It was Madison, ironically, who made the call. Perhaps out of guilt or a flicker of conscience, she told Elaine and David Carter that Ethan was winning a major award and suggested they show up. Madison herself hadn't spoken to Ethan since the internship fallout, and the tension between them still sat like a stone. But on that warm spring evening, the Carter family sat in the audience, Madison between them. Their expressions were unreadable. Ethan stood behind the stage curtain, fingers trembling slightly. He held a small note card with bullet points he wouldn't use. He had rehearsed the speech twice, but what he would say wasn't on the card. The university president gave a brief introduction outlining Ethan's accomplishments: research in enzymatic mutation, his leadership among undergrads, and his publication at a national level. Then he stepped aside and the spotlight narrowed. Ethan walked slowly to the podium. A smattering of applause rose, then settled into stillness. He looked out at the crowd, not for his parents, but for Lucas. When he found him seated in the second row, nodding gently, something settled in Ethan's chest. "Thank you," he began. "When I first came to this university, I thought achievement would speak loud enough, that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, people would notice. That being good was enough." A pause, a breath. But there's a difference between being seen and being valued. He let the words land. "I didn't come from a background of privilege. I came from a family where success was expected but only celebrated when it came from the right person." There was a stirring in the room. Heads tilted. Eyebrows rose. "I used to have a friend," Ethan continued. "Not a real one, an imaginary one. I made him up when I was 8 during a time I felt invisible. I called him Lucas." Lucas blinked in surprise. He always listened, always believed in me. "Later in life, I met someone with that same name, and I realized something: the people we imagine in our loneliest moments are often reflections of who we hope to be." Murmurs. Some audience members smiled, others sat very still. For a long time, I thought success would fill the silence. But what truly healed me wasn't awards or titles. It was learning to befriend the parts of me I thought unworthy, and surrounding myself with people who mirrored that belief back to me. A beat: to my professors, thank you. To my peers, thank you. To those who saw me when it wasn't convenient, thank you. He looked directly at Lucas. To the boy I used to invent and the man who became real, I see you now, and I see myself. A hush held the auditorium. Then applause erupted. It wasn't polite. It was raw, genuine, sustained. Ethan stepped back, heart pounding but light. When he returned to his seat, the ceremony blurred around him. Afterward, in the lobby, people congratulated him. Professors hugged him. Strangers shook his hand. His parents approached slowly. Elaine had tears in her eyes. David looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. But Ethan didn't rush toward them. He didn't need their validation. Madison stood a few feet away. For once, she didn't speak. And Ethan? He smiled, turned to Lucas and said, "Let's go home." He wasn't alone. He never really had been. He just needed to remember who had always stood beside him, real or imagined. And in that truth, he stood taller than ever before. The days following the Whitaker Medal ceremony melted into a haze of public recognition and private introspection. News outlets picked up the story. Academic blogs reposted his speech. Hashtags like #EthanCarterTruth and #ResilientVoices gained traction. Within a week, Ethan had become an unexpected symbol of perseverance. It wasn't about his GPA or even the award, it was his voice trembling, yet certain, admitting pain and loneliness without bitterness. Comment threads filled with people saying, "I saw myself in him." Gregory Salazar, the CEO of Orion Biopharma, didn't need a hashtag to be intrigued. He'd been there that night not by coincidence. A trustee friend had mentioned a quiet prodigy whose work in enzyme mutation was more than just promising. Salazar came to observe but stayed because of what he felt. 2 days later, Ethan received a message via his academic inbox. It was discreet, personalized, and signed directly by Salazar's executive assistant. "Mr. Salazar invites you to a private conversation regarding potential opportunities at Orion Biopharma. This conversation is intended to be confidential." Ethan read the email 3 times before responding. Then he closed his laptop and stared out of his window. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply breathed and realized something had shifted. At the meeting, Salazar barely touched on Ethan's academic credentials. He spoke instead of values, of legacy, of scientists who understood suffering not from textbooks but from within. "You know what drives the best breakthroughs?" Salazar asked. "Not fear, not perfectionism. It's empathy. You carry it, Ethan. I saw it in your words." The job offer wasn't just lucrative, it was visionary. Ethan would lead a new wing of research focusing on rare childhood genetic disorders. He would have his own team, creative control, and a platform to affect real lives. Ethan didn't say yes immediately. He let the offer sit in his inbox, glowing like an unopened gift. That same evening, Lucas appeared at his door with a somber look. "You need to hear this from me," Lucas said, showing him his phone. It was a university memo, internal. Madison Carter had been expelled from her graduate program. There had been a second investigation, more thorough this time. It uncovered several instances of plagiarized research proposals, some eerily close to the early drafts Ethan had once left lying around the family home. She hadn't just borrowed his words for one internship. She had built an application track on a scaffold of deception. The administration moved quietly, but the consequence was permanent. Madison's academic record was sealed with dishonor. Her academic future, once curated with care and privilege, crumbled. Ethan stared at the screen. He didn't speak. Lucas waited as if expecting a mix of triumph and justice. But Ethan only whispered, "This isn't what I wanted." Back in Ohio, silence fell over the Carter household. Madison deactivated her social media accounts. Her friends posted vague messages of support. Her world, once vibrant and full of staged successes, grew quiet. A week passed. Then came the voicemail from Elaine. "Ethan, your father and I, we're sorry. We didn't understand the damage we were doing. Madison isn't doing well. She's seeing a therapist, but she asks about you. We were wondering maybe you'd come home for a weekend, just talk. Ethan played the message twice, then deleted it. Another voicemail came, then an email. He didn't reply. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. He had spent a lifetime twisting himself into shapes they could love, only to be left unseen. Now that the mirage of Madison's perfection had shattered, they remembered the son they once ignored. He wasn't ready to be their healer. Instead, Ethan walked to the lab one last time. He packed up his notebooks, his diplomas, and the old framed photo of his dorm room where Lucas once wrote "worth it" on a sticky note after Ethan's first published paper. That night, as the city hummed below, he opened his journal and wrote, "Redemption is not responsibility. Their healing is not my debt. I move forward not out of spite, but because I finally can." He didn't need revenge. He didn't need apologies that arrived too late. He needed only his own permission to rise, and now he had it. It began with an envelope, not an email, not a message. A handwritten letter in a pale blue envelope with Madison's name in looping cursive on the back. It arrived at Ethan's new apartment in Cambridge 2 weeks after the Orion announcement. He hesitated before opening it, his fingers tracing the edges as if the paper might burn with memory. Inside the letter unfolded in trembling handwriting. "Dear Ethan, this is the hardest thing I've ever written. Not because of guilt, though there is plenty of that, but because I don't know how to reach someone I've ignored for so long. You were always the stronger one, the one who didn't need applause or spotlights to matter. I see that now. And I'm ashamed it took your success and my fall for the blinders to come off. Everything I did, all the borrowing, the lies, it came from fear. I wanted to be perfect so badly. I thought if I failed, I'd disappear. I thought that's what being a Carter meant, perfection, no matter the cost. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that truth, even when painful, has power and grace. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand who I am without the mask. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I see you now, and I'm sorry. Love, Madison." Ethan read it 3 times, folded it carefully, then placed it inside the journal he kept beside his bed. But that night, instead of sleeping, he walked the dim-lit streets of Cambridge, reading and rereading her words under the soft hum of streetlights. He found himself seated at a late-night cafe, the letter in his lap, untouched, coffee cooling beside him. He remembered the first time he felt invisible. He was 8. Madison had broken a vase and blamed him. They believed her instantly. He wasn't punished, but he wasn't defended either. That absence of belief hurt more than any grounding. He remembered birthdays, forgotten achievements, dismissed, and moments he swallowed the hurt to keep peace. And yet this letter stirred something foreign hope. A week later, Ethan returned home to find his parents, Elaine and David, waiting out in his apartment. No warning, just a knock. He opened the door, stunned. Elaine's eyes were swollen. David looked like he hadn't slept. There was no pride in their posture, just humility. "We didn't want to just send words," Elaine said. "We needed to see you, if you'll let us." Inside, the conversation stumbled at first. Long silences, nervous glances, then David cleared his throat. "I was wrong, son," he said. "Not just once, for years. I didn't know how to show love that wasn't loud. And in doing that, I missed the son who needed it most." Elaine leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "We created a house where your light was dim to let hers shine. That wasn't fair. We failed you." Ethan listened, really listened. And in doing so, he realized how long he'd yearned to hear these words, not as validation, but as acknowledgement. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. Instead, he spoke. "I appreciate you coming," he began. "And I believe you mean it. But I need to be clear, I'm not your fixer. I'm not your second chance. I'm your son. And if we're going to move forward, it has to be with boundaries. They nodded slowly. I need space. I need respect. I need honesty even when it's uncomfortable. And I need you to accept that I may not always be available to patch up what's broken. Elaine reached across the table, grasping his hand. Lightly. We'll learn, Ethan. We promise. For the first time in years, he believed her. Later that evening, as they left, David paused. You didn't just survive, Ethan. You became extraordinary. And I see you now. Ethan stood in the hallway long after they left, the silence no longer heavy but sacred. He returned to his journal that night, writing, "They came not to fix the past, but to face it. I may not forget, but I can release, not for them, for me." And with that, a new chapter began, not of reconciliation, but of respect. His family script was no longer written in silence and sacrifice. He was rewriting it, on his own terms. 2 years later, the skyline of Seattle shimmered with possibility as Ethan stood before the panoramic windows of his lab at Orion Biopharma. The view was stunning. Sunlight broke through a curtain of clouds and reflected off the buildings below, but it wasn't the view that filled him with awe. It was the path that led him here. Ethan had just finalized the third-stage trials for a gene therapy protocol targeting a rare childhood neurological disorder. The data was promising, even groundbreaking. His name was now whispered across biotech circles, not as a rising star, but as a leader. His team looked to him not just for scientific direction, but for human empathy, his signature approach. It was in that same spirit that the Lucas Foundation was born. Named in quiet tribute to the imaginary friend of his childhood, who had become a very real friend in his adult life, the foundation provided scholarships and therapy stipends to young students who faced emotional neglect at home. It offered safe housing, mentorship, and legal aid in severe cases. At the launch event, Ethan didn't give a long speech. He simply said, "This isn't just about brilliance. It's about giving someone the space to be seen, heard, and safe. Sometimes that's where the real genius starts." His words resonated. Donors pledged generously. Students reached out with stories that mirrored his own quiet brilliance, overshadowed by louder siblings' invisible pain beneath perfect grades. The foundation was more than charity. It was justice in motion. In early spring, Ethan received a letter from Madison. Her handwriting had changed, cleaner, more intentional. "Dear Ethan, I'm still in therapy. It's hard work. Sometimes I hate it. Sometimes I love it. Most of the time I cry. But I'm learning how to be someone without the performance, without the costumes. I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you. Not because of what you've built, but because you didn't stop being kind, even when I didn't deserve it. Love, M." He kept the letter in the drawer beside his desk, beneath a photo of the Lucas Foundation's first cohort of students. That summer, he was invited back to his alma mater to deliver the keynote speech to the graduating class. As he stepped onto the stage, applause erupted. But it didn't rattle him anymore. It didn't define him. He smiled, placed his notes down, and looked into the sea of faces, hopeful, anxious, ready to begin. "I used to think value came from being chosen," he began, "by schools, by mentors, by families, but the truth is it comes from not abandoning yourself, from refusing to become small for someone else's comfort, from choosing again and again to believe you are enough." He paused. A silence settled in the room, deep and attentive. 2 years ago, I stood in this hall uncertain if I mattered. Today I stand not just because others see me, but because I finally see myself. The hall erupted. Tears, cheers, stillness. Professors nodded. Students clapped. Somewhere in the audience, Lucas smiled. That night, Ethan walked along the shore of the lake near campus. He carried his journal with him. Pages worn, margins filled. He reread old entries, some angry, others broken, most filled with questions. He sat by the water, opened a fresh page, and wrote, "To the boy who was never seen, thank you for never letting go. You carried us here, and now we fly." The moon hung bright. The wind kissed the surface of the lake, and for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like someone else's echo. He felt like light, his own.